Tonight, we will explore one of the greatest problems ever faced by our nation. We're going to look back at a time when our nation was at a certain crossroads. We were facing an existential threat, and really the way ahead was uncertain. The characters of our story are some of the greatest visionary leaders our nation has ever seen. The decisions that were made essentially redefined Jewish life and spawned a new era of scholarship, of Jewish community, and Jewish living. The problem existed in the 16th century, and a project of unparalleled scope was undertaken, namely the Codification of Halacha. Now I want to give some backstory before we get into the nitty-gritty of what happened and why it happened and who the players were. And going all the way back to the beginning, the birth of our nation, we know that the Torah was given to us in two formats. There was the written Torah and the oral Torah. There are some historical nuggets that are germane to the discussion of oral Torah. For example, in modern times, in the caves of the soldiers of Bar Kokhba, they found little tefillins. Now, the Torah itself describes in 4 places to put on tefillin, but it doesn't describe what it is. That's in the oral Torah. And we found today relics, remnants, archaeological discoveries of ancient tefillin that exactly mirror ours. And indeed, when the Yemenite community came from Yemen to join the Jewish community in Israel, they brought the tefillin with them, and we see there is uniformity in tefillin across the board. This week's parsha, for example, we have the mitzvah of the 4 species of sukkahs. One of them is the pre-Eitz Hadar, which means the fruit of a beautiful tree. There's a lot of beautiful trees out there, but somehow there is ubiquity of agreement that this tree and this fruit is the citron. And that's kind of some historical examples of the existence of oral Torah. But as we know, oral Torah was eventually written down in stages. Previously, starting from Moses to Joshua to the elders, etc., the oral Torah, which is really the way to understand and apply the Torah, was transmitted orally from one generation to the next generation, teacher to student, parent to child. The Sanhedrin was the body that was responsible for this transmission to make sure that no mistakes happened. But over time, circumstances mandated that these were eventually written. Now, what's important to stress, and it's critical to our story, is that while the oral Torah was indeed written, it was written incrementally. Only the minimum that was necessary to be written down at any given point was written down. It wasn't written down all at once, and the reason why is because there was a problem, there was damage that could be caused by the writing down of the oral Torah, and to mitigate that, they only wrote down what was absolutely necessary. And we know Rabbi Judah the Prince, at the end of the 2nd century, he was the leader of the Jews, and he wrote down the Mishnah. And this was a monumental project, and we spoke about it previously. But the Mishnah contained just the rigid, abstract laws, lacking all the detail behind the laws that was left oral. So we have the Mishnah being written down, 63 books, which is just the laws. The Talmud, which is the explication of the laws, the explanation of the laws, the sources, how do those laws go all the way back to the written Torah, examples, exceptions, applications, all that was maintained oral for 300 years until circumstances mandated that it too be written down. And thus, we know, we told the story previously, that in the 5th century, the Talmud was written down. Now, the Talmud itself is a huge encyclopedia of Jewish everything, but included in the Talmud is a certain sliver, which is the most important part of Torah, which is what we call Halacha. And Halacha is the subject of what we're going to talk about tonight. and how it developed is not the right word, how its writing and codification developed. We know the Talmud contains halacha. That much is clear and everyone agrees upon it. But how exactly to draw the halacha out of the Talmud is a very hard thing to do. But when the Talmud was written, the halacha was never drawn out and put in a separate document because, like we said, they wanted to mitigate, to minimize the amount of oral Torah that was indeed written. So they kept it in there in this one bigger document, hidden in various different places, to ensure that that would still be perpetuated orally. And we talked about the Gaonic era, the era that came after the writing of the Talmud, where you have about 500 years where the Jewish people are led by the heads of the yeshiva in Babylon, and their primary objective in the development of the writing of the oral Torah was to provide additional clarification for the Talmud and to provide answers and halachic guidance in the framework of the Talmud for the people of the generation. But there were only a few efforts made, and none of them comprehensive, in the Gaonic era to actually write down a separate book of halacha. There was some, but not quite comprehensive. The era that we have been discussing the past couple of weeks, the era known as the Rishonim, about the year 1000 to the year 1500, is where there's an important shift in the mindset of the Jewish scholars. There was a boom of different kinds of Torah literature. We see an enormous explosion of codifications of halacha and comprehensive commentaries on the Talmud. It's clear that they recognized that the Talmud on its own is going to be mystifying for the people of their generation, and therefore it was necessary to write down an accompanying book of halacha for the Talmud. And thus we see many different commentaries on the Talmud itself. For example, Rabbeinu Gershom, he was one of the first of the Rishonim, and he wrote a commentary that graces the sides of the Talmud. Rabbeinu Hananel, which is one of his students, he too wrote a book of halacha on the Talmud. And of course, none of them more famous than Rashi, who wrote a commentary on the Talmud. Now, what's interesting about this particular stage in writing down commentaries is that a commentary on the Talmud will help someone understand the Talmud, but it won't actually necessarily inform the reader of halacha. If you read Rashi, it's amazing because it'll help you understand the Talmud. But the halacha itself is buried in the Talmud. So Rashi is not necessarily going to guide you to actually find the halacha. There's another stage of literature that becomes very popular at this time, and that is what's called chidushim, or new insights on the Talmud. And for example, Rashi's grandchildren, they opened the yeshiva of the Tosafos, and they wrote, essentially, the insights into taking the Talmud as a whole and comparing and contrasting different parts of the Talmud and developing and writing their analyses of what they discovered. And of course, Ramban, we spoke about the Ramban recently. The Rashba was the Ramban student, and the Ritva. These were monumental commentaries on all of Talmud that were never done before and became very popular in this era. Of course, during this era as well, we see an explosion with staggeringly voluminous commentary, responsa, halachic responsa on the Talmud that was never seen before. For example, the Rashba, he wrote more than 3,000 responsas on halacha, which It's just an enormous amount of writing that letters were addressed to him, and he had to respond unto an incredible amount of questions coming from all over the world. But most significant for our discussion is the comprehensive books of Halacha based upon the Talmud. These were books that are isolated on their own right, books that can be learned in absence of Talmud on their own, and books that are going to be at the baseline of any future deep dive into Halacha. We talked about the Rif. The Rif was one of the first Sephardic Rishonim, and he was the first one to write a comprehensive book of Halacha. And if you open up a Talmud, any Talmud, you'll see in the back, you scroll down to the back, and you'll see like a digest of the Talmud that contains just the Halacha. So he pulled out the Halacha from amongst the rest of the Talmud and wrote it in his own book. Now you have a book of Halacha. Now he didn't revolutionize the format, because the format's still along in the Talmud. He just pulled out the sections that are applicable to Halacha, but that was a huge innovation of the time. Now, like never before, there's a book that you could just read to get the Halacha out of the Talmud. What do we do? What's the actual Halacha? How do we observe it? The Rambam, he innovated yet further. He wrote a book of Halacha based upon the Talmud that doesn't follow the structure of the Talmud. It doesn't go along with the pages. It doesn't go along with the tractates. He had his own new format. He developed 14 different sections. Each section broken down to subsections. Each subsection broken down to chapters, all organized from scratch, based upon conceptual order. The Rambam says, okay, well, what's the most important thing? Foundations of Torah. When he talks about theology, he talks about prophecy, he talks about studying Torah, he talks about free will. He organizes it on his own. And he doesn't actually tell you where it comes from. He writes in the introduction, this is from the Talmud. And all the accompanying work and everything that has come since then. But he doesn't actually trace it back. It's its own book. And then there are other books of that kind. But I think it's important to stress that there was a shift here. And there's a recognition that for the Jewish people to continually exist and to thrive, Jews need to know how to behave as Jews. And the way you behave as Jews is by following Halacha. Well, Halacha is the practical application of Torah. And that is the most important part of Torah, because that's how you actually behave. And to do that, people need to know. And back in times of yore, they could rely on the oral Torah. But times changed, circumstances changed, the state of the Jewish people changed, and now they have to have a portable and transportable version of the oral Torah, of the Halacha, that they could learn. And Maimonides, in his introduction, he's trying to justify, why am I doing this? Why am I reinventing oral Torah, essentially, writing a brand new version of it, writing it down when it's called the oral Torah? Why is it written down? And he writes, and I want to quote you from his introduction. He gives the history of Torah, and he says, well, how do you know what's Halacha? You take the two Talmuds and all the accompanying works, and from there, you find what's forbidden, what's permitted, what's clean, what's unclean, what's liable, who's responsible to pay, who's not responsible, who's exempt, what's fit for use, what's not fit for use, what's kosher, what's not kosher, according to the unbroken oral tradition from Moshe at Sinai. It's all there in the Talmud. However, to glean it from the Talmud, you have to have the time and the peace of mind and the intellectual capacity to do that. And he traces how throughout the history of the writing of the oral Torah, times and situations mandated that it wasn't possible anymore. So he says, well, Rabbi Judah the Prince had to write down the Mishnah. And afterwards, in the court of Rashi, they wrote on the Talmud. And the people of Israel were scattered throughout the nations. They reached the most remote parts of the world. There was armed struggle. There was difficult to communicate. Study of Torah declined. And the people of Israel ceased to gather in places of study in their thousands and their myriads. So what he's pointing out is that there has to be this change that is going to respond to the change of the reality of the time. And in our times, says the Rambam, severe troubles come one after another. All are in distress. The wisdom of our sages had disappeared. The understanding of our discerning men is hidden. Remember, the Rambam himself, he had to flee Spain at a young age and then end up in Morocco, eventually end up in Egypt. Why? Because the radical Muslims of the time, the Almohads, were killing Jews left, right, and center, forcing them to convert. Those conditions are not conducive to 15 years of uninterrupted study where you could go and learn all of oral Torah from your teacher. Thus, continues the Rambam, the commentaries, the responses, the settled laws of the Gonim rule, which were clear at the time, have in our times become hard to understand. Only a few people properly understand them. So the laws, the Halacha itself is becoming hard to understand. And one hardly needs to mention the Talmud itself, the Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, Sefer Sefri, Toseftot, all the other accompanying works, which all require a broad mind, a wise soul, and considerable time before one can correctly know from them what is forbidden or permitted and the other rules of the Torah. For this reason, I, Moshe, son of Rabbi Maimon, found the situation unbearable. Relying on the Almighty, I intently studied all these works. And I wrote, and I saw fit to write what can be determined from all these books in regards to what's forbidden, permitted, clean, unclean, all the halacha, everything in clear language, so that the whole oral Torah becomes thoroughly known to all, without any questions, without any disagreements, without any going through the Talmud itself, just in accordance with a law that has been accepted from the times of the Talmud to now. This is so that all the rules should be accessible to the small and the great, every commandment, all the legislation, in short, so that a person should need no other work in the world regarding the halacha. All you need is this and the written Torah, and you'll have it all. Thus I have called this work the Mishnah Torah, the complete repetition of Torah. All you got to do is study the written Torah, and then you have and this book, and you have the written Torah and oral Torah together. The Rambam is highlighting his book, of course, but we see this was an effort that was systemic at the time amongst the rabbis. They're all writing all these commentaries in the Talmud. Everyone's explaining the Talmud. Everyone's writing these books of halacha. Why? Because it was necessary. If people didn't write them, people didn't understand the Talmud, you have to write commentaries in the Talmud. People didn't know halacha, you got to write down halacha. And the Rambam is also noting, he's also pointing out specifically that the real problem that prompted this all is that the normal course of action where the tradition could be transmitted from teacher to student, that was no longer tenable. And indeed, after the Rambam's time, we see that things began to deteriorate yet further. And that is essentially laying the groundwork for the future decisions that needed to be made. Let's start in France. We know that the Crusades came, and they, together with the accompanying persecutions, if you remember, we spoke about when they burnt all the Talmud in Paris, for example, 1244, that eliminated French Jewry. And they had to flee. Many of them fled to Germany. And thus, we used to be called the Tsarfatim. The French people, we came to Ashkenazim, those from Germany. Why? Because we moved there. A lot of people moved there because they were, life in Christian Europe and France was very difficult, and you had to escape. Who was the leader of the Jews at the time? Is someone by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe, who was known by the name of his magnificent book, the Or Zarua. So he fled from France. He ended up in Vienna, and he writes this one-volume book of halacha called the Or Zarua, which is a distillation of all the teachings of the preceding Ashkenazic giants in one book. And just like the Rambam in the Sephardic world, he too is writing a one-volume book that contains everything. Now, of course, this reflects the challenges of the time. To perpetuate the Torah under such chaotic living conditions like the Crusades and all the persecutions is very difficult. So you have to make it transportable, and he wrote a book. And he's trying to rebuild the collected knowledge of the Ashkenazic world that was destroyed, or at least parts of it were. Now, he had a student by the name of Rabbi Meir ben Baruch, known to us as the Maharam of Rothenburg, Maharami Rothenburg. He was one of the editors of Tosfos, and he became the absolute unquestioned leader of the Ashkenazic community after the death of his teacher. So much so that we have today extant about 3,500 letters that he wrote to Jews all over the world answering their questions. And Jews in Germany at that time were considered, quote, servants of the royal chamber. They could be punitively taxed, and they weren't allowed to leave. So in 1285, the Maharam of Rothenburg, he decides to flee Europe and move to Israel. Along the way, he's recognized by a Jewish apostate who rats him out, and he is eventually jailed by the king of Germany, essentially, Rudolf of Habsburg, in a castle, and he holds him out for ransom. He's demanding an exorbitant sum of 30,000 marks for his release. So can you imagine? The leader of the entire Ashkenazic Jewish world is placed in incarceration and held for ransom for a staggering figure. Just think about what kind of conditions those were. Those don't sound like prime conditions to perpetuate oral Torah. Now, there is a halacha brought down the Talmud that you're not allowed to redeem prisoners for more than they're actually worth, because then you're going to encourage further exploitations. So this Rabbi Meir, even though the community raised the funds to redeem him, he says, no, absolutely not. I don't let you redeem me for 1 penny more than I'm worth as a slave, so to speak. So there's this standoff. The king says, I'm not releasing him, and he says, I'm not willing to be ransomed. And he ended up staying there for the last years of his life. He died there. He left a will, and his will says, do not pay ransom to be granted the release of my body. And it was only 14 years after he died that a rich Jew ransomed his body, and he was actually buried in a Jewish cemetery. And what's really remarkable is that even though he was incarcerated, he was allowed to have visitors. So old people came to ask questions. It became a thoroughfare, his jail cell. And he was allowed to write responsa. And we have responsa today that are written from this castle in Eisenheim, in Einsesheim. We have letters today written like that. But you clearly see that there is a deterioration in conditions for the Jewish people. Now, his student, one of the most impactful leaders of the era, is Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, known to us as the Rosh. If you look at the back of every Talmud, you'll have the Rif and you'll have the Rosh. He wrote a halachic commentary that appears in the back of every volume of Talmud printed. Now, he was the rabbi of all Jews of Ashkenaz, and he was traveling for the benefit his community, and he traveled to Spain, and he's in Toledo in Spain, and the great rabbi shows up from Germany, and they say to him, you know what? Why don't we offer you a job to become our rabbi? And, thinking about the fact that he has an opportunity to escape, he accepts the offer. So you have this really interesting nugget of history that the great Ashkenazic rabbi becomes the head of the Sephardic community in Spain. Now he brings alongside him his son, Rabbi Yaakov, who also wrote a magisterial and innovative book of Halacha called the Arba'a Turim, the 4 columns, or 4 rows. And like the Rambam before him, he also begins from scratch. I'm going to write the book of Halacha with a heavy emphasis on the Ashkenazic Halacha. And while my father, the Rosh, wrote in the back of the Talmud, he didn't depart from the structure of the Talmud. I'm going to start from scratch. Well, the Rambam started in conceptual order. He wrote his in chronological order. Well, what's the first thing that happens? You wake up in the morning. What's the laws of waking up in the morning? He writes those laws. And then the laws of the day, and the laws of prayers, and laws of tefillin, and laws of Shabbos, laws of holidays. And he breaks down his book, not into 14 sections like the Rambam, but into 4. Orach Chaim, the way of life, which is Jewish living. Prayer, Shabbat, festivals. Yoredeya, which is ritualistic law, like the laws of Nida, the laws of Shechita, kosher laws, Even Ezer laws of marriage and divorce. And Choshen Mishpat. Mishpat is justice, or judgment, which is financial laws, damages laws, laws of legal procedure. And this incredible book is also innovative in another way, because he himself, in his book, he quotes many of his contemporaries. He'll quote the Rambam, he'll quote the Rif, he'll quote his father, Vadoni Avi HaRosh. He writes it all the time. And my father, my master, the Rosh, he says this. And it's a much more expansive book. And I'll bring you his conclusions. But while things were great, so to speak, given where they had come from, that these 3 massive leaders, 4 essentially, the Orzerua, the Marami Rottenberg, the Rosh, and the Tur, had rebuilt a lot of the collected knowledge of the Ashkenazi Jews through these giants, it's still very harsh and very oppressive conditions. And the Sephardic Jews, they don't have much time either, because during the 13th century, the Spanish Reconquista, the Christian Reconquista of Spain, was going to unleash terror on the Sephardic Jews living there. So their golden age was rapidly waning as well. So essentially, for all intents and purposes, the notion that there could be continued study from rabbi to student with sufficient time and tranquility to transmit all Torah, that's an idea that was going extinct. And with the end of the Rishonim, with that era, came the end of uninterrupted tradition, and hence there's a big problem. Now what? What do we do now? How do we continue the knowledge of oral Torah in our nation? Now, the Rishonim themselves, like we just mentioned, they wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. But one could argue that they wrote too much. And there was a problem. We had a Talmud. It's a whole bookshelf, and it's so complex. And how do you know how to live as a Jew? That was the problem the Rishonim faced. Well, now we don't have a bookshelf. We don't have a bookcase. We have a whole library full of writings. And everyone's trying to make it easy, but ironically, it's even harder now. What do? Do you follow one? Do you abandon the others? Do you study it all? And as a 13-year-old, you need to know how to live as a Jew. You're bar mitzvah. You're obligated in all the mitzvahs. What do you do now? So paradoxically, there's too many options of codified halacha. How are we going to determine which one? How do we know what to do as a Jew? It's an important question. Now, the Jews of Yemen, for example, they solved this problem. They said, we are following the Rambam. Whatever he says is as if it was said by Moshe at Sinai. No questions asked. We're not considering anything else. This is it. For others, it was a grave problem. What do you do? So to address this problem, one of the pivotal characters of Jewish history stepped up and forever changed the landscape of Jewish living. And his name is Rabbi Yosef Karo. He was born in Spain in 1488, just a few years before the Jews were sent packing from Spain. At the age of 3, he fled with his family, along with hundreds of thousands of Jews who left Spain. And they stopped along several places. He was in Turkey for a while, in Greece for a while. I think he might have had a cup of coffee in Egypt as well. Eventually they settled in Tzfat in northern Israel. He's going to go on to become one of the most significant and transformative Jews of his time, and he's going to be the primary catalyst of the next development of the writing down of the oral Torah and the Halacha. Now, I think it's important to stress that there's no superlatives that we could use that would be sufficient to describe the impact of his writings on the Jewish nation. He was a genius and a scholar of astounding proportions, and his literary and halachic works are unmatched in their influence. Now, he writes in the introduction to Bet Yosef the same problem that we're talking about. Like, there's an absolute need to codify halacha. And he outlines the whole problem. What do? You open up one book, he writes, for example, and you read what it says, and you see, like, there's a definitive halacha, or so it is portrayed. What the author fails to do is to mention that there's many other giants who disagree with that, and you read that, you have no idea. And even if you do, you're an aspiring scholar, you don't even know where to start to look. What's the halacha on any given matter? You have to find in the Talmud, you have to find the appropriate sources. It's very difficult. What do? So he says, he writes in his introduction, I set out to write the definitive book that includes all the applicable laws, with all the explanations derived from the sources of the Talmud, with all the disagreements and all the discussions. I'm going to take that proverbial library, and I'm going to bring that back to one book. Ended up being 22 volumes, but you get the drift. And I'm going to discuss all their debates and present it all, lay it all out before you. And once I have the layout of the map of every given section, we're going to find halacha. We'll see how he did it in a second. Now, to avoid unnecessary duplication, he chose to base it upon one of the books of the Rishonim. He was going to take one of the halachic books of the Rishonim and use that to springboard towards his book. Initially, he chose what's the greatest book of halacha, the Rambam. And he started writing a book on that, a commentary on that that's going to be the super, uber, duper commentary that's going to include all those that disagree and everything. That was his plan. Ultimately, he changed his mind, because the Rambam only offers the conclusions. It only gives one angle. Now, what's interesting about this is that that book that he started and aborted, he didn't actually discard. He actually turned that work on the Rambam into a commentary on the Rambam itself. Now, this book, known as the Kesef Mishnah, this book itself, if this was his only book that he ever wrote, he would have cemented his status as one of the giants of Torah of all of history. He was a young man when he wrote this. And if you remember, like the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam's book, was written without sources. So the Kesef Mishnah, which is Rabbi of Kairo's commentary in it, he explains and sources all the laws, and he responds to all the critiques that crept up on the Rambam, most notably from the Raavad. Now, it's actually plain words. The Mishnah Torah is the doubling or repetition of Torah. Mishnah means to double, repeat. Kesef Mishnah is the doubling of the money, which is a play on words based upon what happened in Genesis, where the brothers came back to Joseph and they brought double the money to pay back to Joseph, because Joseph gave them the grain and put their money back in their satchels. So they came back with double the money. So he had an affinity, it kind of hints to his name, Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, Joseph. So he called his book Kesef Mishnah, doubling the money. Now this comprehensive commentary on the Rambam is included in the margins of all subsequent editions of Mishnah Torah. Now ultimately, he chose the aforementioned tour, the 4 columns that we spoke about of Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Rabbi Asher, as the baseline of his work. And the reason is because that incorporates many other commentaries in it. And this is arguably one of the only times in history where a commentary on a given work is going to have a much greater impact than the work it is based upon. So the Bet Yosef, which ended up being the book that he wrote, his commentary on the Torah actually outshone the Torah itself, which is quite a statement given that the Torah, the book that he wrote his commentary on, was the authoritative law book for all of Ashkenazi Jewry. And then his commentary actually outweighed that. Now, what was his format? So any law the Torah brought, he would source it. Is it in the Mishnah? Is it the Brisa, the Seth, Sephra, Sephrim, Mechilta, Torah, Kohanim, Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem? He would find you the source. And he brings down the source. And he would explain, is this something which is universally agreed upon, or is it a machlokas? Is it a subject of disagreement? And he would expound upon the various different opinions. Sometimes the Torah would bring a disagreement. Sometimes he would omit the disagreements. And he'd bring them regardless. And explain, why does one side say this, and why does one side say that? And bring laws that were not included in the Torah and explain those. Essentially, he created an encyclopedia of all of the Talmud and all the commentaries, organized to perfection, rock-solid argumentation and analysis. And once all that's laid before the reader, he approached the most critical task of determining halacha. And he writes in his introduction, well, how do you do that? Who am I, says Rabbi Joseph Cairo, to try to pick fights between the Rambam and the Rif, these giants, these angels, veritable angels? I'm not going to be the one to stick my head between these great mountains, he writes. So he develops a formula. And his formula is based upon what the Sanhedrin used to do. Sanhedrin would say, well, listen, you have the Sanhedrin, you have 30 rabbis, the greatest rabbis of the time on one side, and 40 on the other side. How do you choose? Well, they have a rule. You follow the majority. Says Rabbi Joseph Cairo, I'm going to take the 3 pillars of halacha, the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam, and whenever 2 of them agree on any given matter, the halacha is going to follow them, unless there's a preponderance of other commentaries who disagrees. That's his rule. And when there's no consensus, he's going to seek out the rulings of others, the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ran, the Mordechai, the Smad, all the others, and he's going to find the position that the majority of them veer to. And you read this book, it's first of all, it's incredibly comprehensive, because any law, so it could be a one-line law, he'll bring you all the commentaries, everything, lays it all out there, and at the end he says, well, you see, obviously, how the opinions are leaning this way, we're going to follow the halacha in this way. And that today, the modern edition of Tur with the Bet Yosef is printed in 22 volumes. Now, to make halacha more accessible, he composed a shortened synopsis of the Bet Yosef called the Shulchan Aruch, the set table. In this work, he took just the end of that essay on every given halacha, just the conclusions, and wrote down in a book. And it was designed to be easily read, easily memorized, so everyone, young people, old people, scholars, novices, could have the halacha on their fingertips. And he writes in his introduction, the objective of this is to break it down to 30 different parts, so that way you could study the entirety of the Shulchan, know all of Jewish halacha. You do one section a day, and you read it over the course of a month. That's his objective. Now, that's his book. And what's really remarkable, one of the great twists of Jewish history, is that on the other side of the world, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who was the Rabbi of Krakow, he was concurrently working on the same exact project to codify halacha. And perhaps you could argue that the figure most instrumental in assuring that the Shulchan Aruch becomes accepted universally was him. Because he made a choice to not write his own version of the Shulchan Aruch, to have 2 Shulchan Aruchs, one the Ashkenazi Shulchan Aruch and Sephardic Shulchan Aruch, we're back to square one. Rather, he chose to embroider his own work together with the work of Rabbi Yosef Cairo and create one universal Shulchan Aruch. Now, what's interesting is that he had a whole different methodology of how to determine halacha. Instead of relying on the big 3, he chose to follow the later commentaries. And he quotes the Talmud. Talmud says is that if you have a disagreement in the Talmud itself, and you have one rabbi who says a halacha, who's an earlier one of the rabbis, and one who says one of the later ones, that we follow the later opinion. And the idea being is, well, the later rabbi, he had more information, and if he chose to go against what the earlier rabbi said, it must be that he had reasons to do so. So, Rabbi Moshe Isserles' argument says, wait, if that follows in Talmudic law, why should they not follow in Rishonic law? The Rambam is one of the earlier of the Rishonim. The Rif is one of the earliest of the Rishonim. Why don't we follow the later Rishonim, who had the Rambam and the Rif and chose to reject it for whatever reason and follow them for halacha? That was his argument. And he actually criticizes, in his introduction, he criticized the Bet Yosef's approach. He points out, he says, well, the Rif, upon which the Bet Yosef is relying, one of his three pillars, he rules in the Talmud that we follow the later opinion. So why would that principle not hold in determining what the halacha is of the Rishonim? And Rabbi Isserles was also particularly bothered that the Bet Yosef's conclusions frequently clashed with the accepted customs of the Ashkenazi communities. So the Ashkenazic customs, which were based upon the later Ashkenazic rulings, a lot of them were in direct conflict with the Shulchan Aruch. And he was very disturbed by that. But in his humility and his visionary sense of the possibilities, he chose not to author his own book, rather to insert his glosses, his hagoos, his comments on the Shulchan Aruch itself. By doing this, he ensured that the Shulchan Aruch could be the book of Jewish law, the book of codified halacha for all Jews. Now, he also followed Rabbi Yosef Kairo's position by writing it in two formats. Just like Rabbi Kairo wrote the Bet Yosef, which is the expanded version, all the way back from the Talmud, everything, and then writing the succinct, synopsized version, he did the same thing. He wrote the Darkei Moshe on the Torah, and the succinct, synopsized version of Shulchan Aruch, a succinct, synopsized version like the Shulchan Aruch, which he called the Mapah, which is the tablecloth for the set table in which he inserts his commentaries. So what's the legacy of the Shulchan Aruch? I think clearly it codified halacha, it achieved its goals, but also it spawned a whole new era of halachic writings. Very quickly, there's an enormous corpus of commentaries that were written on the Shulchan Aruch itself. And it's a wonderful, ironic twist that the sheer volume of halachic writings on the Shulchan Aruch actually created the same problem that it was written to fix. And in the modern bookcase, and even in the modern Shulchan Aruch, it's no longer written down to be studied in 30 days. It's written down essentially to be studied in 30 months at a minimum, maybe even 30 years, because there's so much commentary written on it, and it's so voluminous, the amount of writings, that we essentially have the same problem that we had 500 years ago. And there's been many or several modern attempts to codify halacha written since. But I would say, in a similar way to the Rambam's quest to end all books with one book, the Shulchan Aruch's quest to do the same didn't quite work out as intended. But I would argue that nonetheless, the greatest legacy and achievement of any work is that it redefines the discussion. There's no way to talk about halacha, there's no way to begin talking about halacha without beginning with the Shulchan Aruch. By that barometer, the Shulchan Aruch indeed more than achieved its objective. It became the centerpiece of Jewish law. It's the point of departure for all subsequent halachic works. They all begin with the Shulchan Aruch, and I would say it's a legacy, or this legacy is a testament to Rabbi Joseph Kairo and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who were unmatched visionaries and scholars who shaped halacha for all future generations. So that's the story of Halacha. And I'm willing to take questions now.
What year again was that?
We're talking about the 16th century. So Rabbi Joseph Kara died in, I think, 1575. And he was born in 1480. So he lived a relatively long life. He was almost 90 years old when he died. He wrote many other books as well. Like, he wrote a book, for example, he used to have an angel come, just to give you a sense of the personality. He had an angel come to study with him every night. And he wrote a book of, like, the diary, minutes of his discussions with the angels. The tradition has it that whenever he opened up a book to check up a source, it always opened up right to the correct place. You know, sometimes you have it where you open up a book and boom, you get it in the right place. That was him all the time. And whenever it didn't happen, he's like, he knew God was upset at him. But these are tremendously rich personalities. But obviously his primary objective of his life and his writings was to codify halacha because there was a grave need to do so.
So Rabbi, in the Shulchan Aruch, it has within it both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic? Because
so
there are differences there. Does he incorporate that?
Yeah, so if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, you'll see...
No, I've never
we don't have a copy
seen
of it
it,
here.
but...
We don't have a
okay.
copy of it here, unfortunately.
We should have.
We should have. We're looking for sponsors.
Yeah, well, that's right. We need to have that, don't we?
Is there a sponsor? Don't. Yeah. Do it here. No. So you read a Shulchan Aruch, you'll see that it has different fonts. You start reading one font, and then it says Hagra, which means here's a comment, and it goes to a different font. And it's all marbleized together.
So that's how they do it.
Yes.
So when someone who's knowledgeable is reading it, then they know how to discern.
Yeah, and
those.
it's also written in a different font. Yes.
Yeah, because of that. Okay. The other question I have is, if I could just ask one more. Is there anyone today who would be considered a giant like that in modern times now that's trying to do the same
Well,
thing?
Rabbi Ovadia Yosef.
Ovadia Yosef?
Yeah, I omitted a whole list of people that were doing this in modern times.
Okay.
But the Mishnah Berurah, for example, Mishnah Berurah was only written on one section of Shulchan Aruch, on Orach Chaim. Mishnah Berurah was written by the Chavetz Chaim, but it was an attempt to do the same thing.
How about Moshe Feinstein?
I mean, Moshe Feinstein. He didn't write it's his own book. He wrote Responsa. But yes, he was considered the unquestioned halachic master of the world, certainly for America. But this is an ongoing thing.
Yeah,
it's
and
pretty
it's
fascinating.
never going to stop either. Because
Yeah,
there are
well,
always
that's what
brilliant
Torah is.
minds
That's what Torah is.
Yeah.
Torah doesn't stop.
Right.
But Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, for the Sephardic
Okay.
Jews, he wrote like 75 volumes of just halacha.
Something.
It is.
Okay, so that's the story of halacha.
So
Next week, go
the
ahead.
Shulchan Aruch is pretty much the definitive one that people go to.
Yeah, well,
this
it's,
day.
yes. If you follow Shulchan Aruch, you're following Jewish law. That's as simple as that. Next 2 weeks, something very exciting. We have the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War and the conquest of Jerusalem, or the reunification of Jerusalem. We're going to stop talking about the Middle Ages, and for a little bit in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the conditions that led to the Six-Day War and the Six-Day War itself. So that's next week and the week that follows it. This was a lot of fun. I look forward to doing this again.